She kissed him because he was the coldest thing in the room, and a cold man, she reasoned, in the half-second she had to reason anything, would not mistake it for wanting. He was the one the whole bar bent away from the still point. Everyone else's eyes slid around, and Nora Bennett, cornered out of exits, with the man she'd once loved closing the gap between them, crossed the last 3 feet, took a fistful of a stranger's lapel, and kissed the most untouchable man in Kansas City like she meant it. He did not pull away. He did not push her off. He set his glass down and put one hand flat against the small of her back, like he'd been expecting her his whole life. And when the danger behind her finally gave up and left, he spoke against her ear in a voice with frost on every word. "That was well done," said Damiano Vitale. "Now sit down and tell me who you're running from, because in about a minute, 30 men are going to walk in here and call me by a name that's going to change how you feel about what you just did." The Venatoria on Southwest Boulevard kept its lights low and its whiskey high, and on a Thursday in February it was the only warm room in Kansas City that Nora Bennett could afford to sit in. She had a corner stool at the short end of the bar, a glass of rye she was making last, and the leather portfolio on her knee that she had not been able to stop thinking about for 6 hours, because in it was a single page of a restaurant's accounts payable that had at 4 o'clock that afternoon made the floor tilt under her. Nora was a bookkeeper. That was the word on her business card, and it was the word people used when they wanted to look past her, which was, most of the time, what she actually was. What she was better at than anyone in the state of Missouri, though almost no one had ever bothered to find out, was a reader of money. Money has a handwriting. People don't believe that until they've spent 11 years the way Nora had, bent over other people's ledgers under a bad lamp. But it's true. The way a person structures a lie in numbers is as particular as the way they loop a lowercase g. The vendors they invent, the amounts they favor, the days of the month they like to move money, the round numbers they can't resist, the way they pad a legitimate invoice by a percentage that feels safe to them and is therefore always the same percentage. Give Nora Bennett a year of a company's books, and she could tell you not just whether someone was stealing, but what kind of person they were, careful or greedy, panicked or patient, doing it once out of desperation or every month out of appetite. She was 34. She was heavy. A big woman, wide through the shoulder and hip. The largest person in every conference room where the partners let her sit in the back and take notes. She was better qualified to have written. She knew the whole grammar of being looked past. The client who addressed his questions to the thin young associate, while Nora, who had found his error, sat 2 feet away. The way bookkeeper was said with a little downward tuck, as if the counting of money were a lesser thing than the having of it. She had made her peace with it a long time ago, and turned it into a kind of cover. If no one looked at her, no one watched what she was reading, and Nora Bennett had spent 11 years reading toward one thing. Her father had been an accountant. Thomas Bennett kept the books for a wholesale meat distributor on the East Bottoms for 26 years. A good, dull, honest business of invoices and freight and cold storage. And he was the kind of man who reconciled to the penny and slept well because of it. He used to tell Nora, when she was a girl doing her homework at his desk, that a ledger was a confession. Everybody tells the truth in the numbers eventually, he'd say, because numbers are the one language you can't lie in for long without the lie adding up to something. In the winter, Nora turned 23. A second set of books surfaced. They were kept in Thomas Bennett's system in his format under his login, and they showed $11 million moving through the meat distributor's accounts over 4 years. Cash businesses layered into legitimate freight structured deposits, a lattice of shell vendors, money that belonged to people who needed it to come out clean on the other side. His name was on all of it. His hand, apparently, in every entry. He said the same 11 words for the entire 19 months it took them to break him. I never opened those accounts. Someone kept a second ledger in my name. Nobody believed him. The books were too good, too consistent, too clearly his. He was convicted of money laundering and fraud, and the distributor dissolved 4 months into his prosecution and folded its assets into a holding company, and that holding company had one signature on its incorporation papers. And Nora had read that signature so many times over 11 years that it had stopped being a name and become a shape she saw when she closed her eyes. C. Bruno. Thomas Bennett died of a heart attack at 58 in the federal penitentiary at Leavenworth, 30 miles up the river from his own desk, in the second year of a 9-year sentence. The official record of the United States still says he was a launderer. Nora kept his working papers, 11 years of them, and the 4 crucial years in a fireproof box in the closet of a rented duplex off Truce Avenue. The real ledgers, the honest ones, and beside them photocopies of the second set, the forged ones, the ones kept in his name by someone else's hand. And she had studied that forger's hand for 11 years. She knew it better than she knew her own. She knew the invented vendors, the favored amounts, the exact percentage the forger padded. 3.5 points, always 3.5, a number that felt safe to whoever built those books. She knew that hand the way you know a voice on the phone before they say who's calling. She had never once, in 11 years, found it again. Until 4 o'clock that afternoon, a new client had come to the firm, a small chain of barbecue restaurants, 3 locations, nothing remarkable, and Gerald Thorne, the managing partner, had dumped the intake reconciliation on Nora because it was tedious and beneath the people he liked. And at 4 o'clock, halfway down a page of accounts payable for a barbecue joint on Independence Avenue, Nora Bennett had found a padded invoice from an invented vendor, structured in a lattice she recognized in her spine before her mind caught up. 3.5 points. The same favored amounts. The same hand that had kept a second ledger in her father's name 11 years ago was keeping books for a barbecue restaurant in Kansas City right now, and whoever they were still working, still laundering, still alive. She had photocopied the page and told no one, and left early, which she never did, and walked to the one warm room she could afford, and ordered a rye she couldn't, because her hands would not stop shaking, and she did not want to be alone in her apartment with a box of her dead father's papers and the first live thread she'd found in 11 years. That was where Preston Wilder found her. He came in out of the cold at 9, and a good coat, with the easy, handsome slide he'd had at 28, and had spent well since. Preston had been engaged to Nora for 14 months a lifetime ago, and had ended it 11 weeks after her father's arrest in the parking lot of a courthouse, with a speech about his family's name, and a parting observation that she'd let the stress get to her physically and had never once looked back. He was, she would learn within 90 seconds, no longer merely a coward. He was a coward who worked, now, in the commercial lending division of a bank whose largest private client was a holding company that traced, through 4 layers, to Cesare Bruno. And Preston Wilder had heard that very afternoon from a colleague who'd heard from Gerald Thorne over drinks that the fat bookkeeper from Meridian had been asking pointed questions about the Independence Avenue accounts. He slid onto the stool beside her before she saw him and put his hand over hers on the bar and said, "Nora. Wow. Hey, we should talk. We really shouldn't. See, I think we should, because I heard something today and I want to help you, I genuinely do." His voice was warm and his eyes were not. "You've been poking around some books you shouldn't be poking around, and the people those books belong to. Nora, these are not people who let a thing like that go. I can help. I can make it so nobody ever knows you saw anything, but you have to come with me right now, tonight, and give me what you copied, and let me handle it." Nora's whole body went cold, and it had nothing to do with the rye. He knew, which meant Gerald had talked, and someone had listened, and the thread she'd pulled at 4 o'clock had already been felt on the other end. And Preston Wilder was not here to help her. He was here to collect her and the too tight grip of his hand over hers, and the 2 men who had come in behind him and taken a table by the door without ordering, told her exactly how the rest of the night was meant to go if she stood up and left with him. She looked at the exits. There was one, and it had a table in front of it now. She looked at the bar. There was Grace behind it. Grace Molina, 60, who'd tended this bar for 30 years and had gotten Nora the corner stool the way you give a regular a corner stool. And Grace had clocked the 2 men by the door and had gone still. But a bartender is not a weapon. And then Nora Bennett looked down the length of the bar and saw the one thing in the room that Preston Wilder and his 2 friends were, without quite knowing it, arranging themselves around. There was a man at the far corner, alone, with a glass. He wasn't drinking, and a stillness that the whole room had organized itself away from the way water moves around a stone. He was maybe 40, lean in a charcoal suit, with no tie, dark hair, with a streak of early gray at the left temple, and a face with absolutely nothing on it, not blank. Not cold in the ordinary sense, but cold the way deep water is cold. The kind of cold that means, don't. Even Preston's men had chosen a table that kept a careful distance from that corner, without seeming to have decided to. Nora had 11 years of reading what people were, from how they arranged themselves in a room, and what this room was telling her in the language of avoided sight lines and left space was that the coldest man in it was also the safest possible person to touch. Because a man that untouchable, that unbothered, that clearly beyond the reach of a Preston Wilder could not mistake a desperate woman's gambit for anything as small as desire. So she made a decision in half a second, the way she made decisions about numbers, fast and committed, and without looking back to check. Actually, she said to Preston, standing up and picking up her portfolio, I'm here with someone. And she walked the length of the bar on legs that did not feel like hers, straight up to the coldest man in Kansas City, and before she could think better of it, she took a fistful of his lapel and kissed him. He did not pull away. That was the first thing, the impossible thing, the thing she would turn over for weeks. She had braced for the flinch, for the stranger's startled hands, the pullback, the what are you doing that would blow the whole gambit and leave her exposed in the middle of the room. It didn't come. There was a single still instant where she felt him register what was happening, a pause with a whole intelligence inside it. And then he set his glass down on the bar with an unhurried click, and put one hand flat and warm against the small of her back, and kissed her back like it was the most natural thing in the world, and he had all night. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. It felt like standing in a doorway during a storm. When she drew back, her heart slamming, her face burning, his gray eyes were open and fixed on hers with an expression she had absolutely not expected, which was neither offense nor interest, but a kind of cold, delighted attention. The look of a man who has been bored for a very long time and has just been surprised. Don't turn around, he said quietly before she could speak. Sit next to me. Put your bag on the bar and laugh at something I said. She sat. She put the portfolio on the bar. She laughed badly. Better than that. She laughed again, and this time it came out closer to real because the sheer absurdity of the situation had cracked something open in her chest. And the man's mouth did something at the corner that was adjacent to a smile. The two by the door and the one in the good coat, he said, lifting his glass, speaking into it so no one could read his lips. The coat's the one you know. The other two are muscle, and they're not local, and they're carrying, and they've been watching you since before you got up. His eyes flicked to the mirror behind the bar and back. You didn't pick me by accident. You picked the one man in the room they were keeping their distance from, which means you can read a room, which means you're not stupid, which is the only reason I haven't asked you to explain yourself yet. He set the glass down. So explain yourself, fast. Who's the coat? His name is Preston Wilder. He's my ex-fiancé. He works for a bank. Nora's voice was low and steady now, because giving information was a thing she knew how to do. He came here to make me leave with him and give him something I have, something I copied at work today, that I wasn't supposed to see. And the two men are here to make sure I don't say no. What did you copy? I don't know you. No, the man agreed. You kissed me. That's usually the other order. He turned his head and looked at her fully, and the cold in his face had a floor to it she hadn't seen at first, something patient and very old. Here's what's about to happen, so you're not frightened by it. The people who own that bank client are the same people my family has been at war with for a long time, and their men do not walk into a room I'm in without my knowing why. In about a minute, some of mine are going to come through that door because they know where I am, and it is going to become very clear to the coat and his friends that they walked into the wrong bar tonight. And you are going to see who I am, and you are going to have a feeling about the fact that you kissed me. I want you to have it now, so we can move past it. He extended one hand, formally, absurdly in the middle of all of it. Damiano Vitale. Nora Bennett had grown up in Kansas City. You did not have to know anything about the men who ran the things the city pretended it didn't have to know that name. You knew it the way you knew which stretch of the river went bad in a flood. Not from experience, only from a lifetime of everyone around you being careful about it. Her hand had gone cold in his. "Oh," she said. "There it is," said Damiano Vitale. The door opened. They came in the way she'd been told they would. Not fast, not loud, no masks and no shouting. 4 men in dark coats, snow on their shoulders, and they did not announce anything. They simply came in and took up positions, and the temperature of the whole room changed as the regulars felt it and went quiet in pieces, and the largest of the 4, a giant 6'5", a broken and reset nose, hands like bricks, walked straight down the length of the bar and stopped a respectful distance from Damiano's corner and inclined his head. "Boss?" Enzo Marchetti said. "You went dark for 20 minutes. We came. I wasn't dark. I was occupied." Damiano did not look away from Nora. The 3 by the door. The one in the camel coat is a banker named Preston Wilder, and he brought 2 of Bruno's out-of-town people into a room I was sitting in to lean on this woman. "I'd like to know why Cesare Bruno is spending imported muscle on a bookkeeper. Wouldn't you?" Enzo turned his head slowly toward the table by the door, and Preston Wilder, who had watched the entire thing unfold from the woman he'd come to collect kissing a stranger, to that stranger being surrounded by armed men who called him boss, had gone the specific gray of a man who has understood far too late the size of the mistake he is standing inside of. The 2 out-of-town men were already calculating the exits and finding them staffed. "Nobody does anything in here," Damiano said, still without raising his voice. "There are 40 civilians and a bartender who's been serving me for years." The coat and his friends are going to stand up and walk out and get in their car and go tell Cesare Bruno that the bookkeeper is under my protection now, effective the moment she walked across this room. His eyes stayed on Nora, and they're going to wonder all the way home how she knew to do that, because I'm wondering it myself. Enzo escorted the 3 of them out. Preston did not look at Nora. The out-of-town men looked at her a great deal, memorizing her, which she felt like a cold hand on the back of her neck. And then the door closed and the coldest room in Kansas City slowly began to make noise again. Nora sat on a stool next to the most feared man in the city with her portfolio on the bar between them and her lips still warm and her whole life reorganizing itself around a decision she'd made in half a second. "You're going to want this back," Damiano said, "so I'll say it plainly. You're safe as of tonight, and that's not conditional on anything, and you can walk out of here in 10 minutes and never see me again. And the protection holds because I don't trade in a person's safety. It's the one thing I give clean." He turned his glass a quarter turn on the bar. "But I'm going to ask you one question, and how you answer it is going to decide whether tonight was the worst night of your life or the first good one you've had in a long time." He looked at her. "What did you find in those books, Nora Bennett? And why does a man like Cesare Bruno already know your last name?" And Nora, who had told no one who had walked 11 years toward a thread she'd been afraid she would never find, looked at the one man in Kansas City with the power to make the guilty answer for it, and made her second irreversible decision of the night. "Because his people took everything from my father using a set of books somebody forged in his name," she said. "And I found the same hand today. The same forger. 11 years later, still working, laundering money through a barbecue restaurant on Independence Avenue." Her voice did not shake. "My father died in Leavenworth for what that person did, and I am the only human being alive who can prove those books aren't his, because I'm the only one who ever learned to read the hand that framed him." Damiano Vitale went very still. "Say that again," he said. "The part about the hand." "Money has a handwriting," said Nora Bennett, "and I've been studying this particular one for 11 years. He came to Meridian Bookkeeping the next morning in daylight in a charcoal suit and did the single most terrifying thing that had ever happened in that office. He became a client. He walked past the reception desk that no one important ever walked past, and he sat down across the good conference table from Gerald Thorne, and he engaged the firm on a substantial retainer, paid that day for forensic accounting services on a portfolio of his family's legitimate businesses, with one written condition attached to the engagement letter. All forensic work to be performed by N. Bennett. No substitutions. Gerald came to find Nora afterward the color of a man who has just understood exactly whose office he manages. Bennett. The client, the one in the conference room. He asked for you. By name. He put it in the engagement letter that only you can. Gerald's voice, which spent its whole life at a confident managerial pitch, had climbed half an octave. Bennett, do you have any idea who that man is? I do, said Nora, capping her pen. He specified you. In writing. Why does a man like that know you're? Because I'm the best forensic mind in this building, Nora said, and I have been for 6 years, and it took someone from outside it to notice. And she walked past Gerald Thorne into the conference room and closed the door on his face. Damiano was standing at the window with his back to the room, looking out at the gray river. That was theatrical, Nora said. It was necessary. Now there's a paper reason on a retainer for me to be in this building and in contact with you, as often as this takes, and no one who works here will ever question it. And your managing partner is going to spend the rest of his professional life being extremely careful with you. He turned. I keep my deals. I told you that last night when the room was still full of my men. This is me keeping the first part. Sit down. Some of what I'm going to tell you is about your father, and some of it is going to be hard, and one part of it is going to make you angry at me. And I'd rather you were angry at me with all the information than a little of it. She sat, and Damiano Vitale told her the truth about the 4 years her father's name had been on $11 million of other people's money. The meat distributor your father kept books for, he said, was, without your father's knowledge, being used by Cesare Bruno to layer cash. Bruno was a launderer then, not a boss. A man with a gift for finding a clean, dull, honest business and running dirty money through it in the owner's name, so that if it ever surfaced, the owner took the weight and Bruno walked away clean with the profit. He turned a folder on the table to face her, bank records, years old. Some of the money he ran through that distributor was mine, my father's, at the time. We were told it was a legitimate freight investment. By the time we understood it was a laundering operation, it had already collapsed, and a bookkeeper we'd never met had already been arrested for keeping the books, and we told ourselves it was the cost of doing business, and we let a stranger go to Leavenworth. He met her eyes. I was 26. It was not my operation, and it was not my decision. But I knew within a year that the man who took the fall hadn't kept those books. Because I knew who did. Because he did the same thing to us, and I did nothing. And your father died. I'm not going to ask you to forgive that. I'd think less of you if you offered. Nora looked at the records on the table for a long moment. You could be lying, she said, about the 26-year-old who didn't decide. That's a very tidy amount of guilt with no actual blood in it. I could be. He didn't flinch. You read money for a living. You can tell when a set of books is telling you the truth and when it's telling you a story that adds up too neatly. Read me the way you'd read a ledger. And decide. So she did. She looked at Damiano Vitale, the way she looked at a reconciliation that balanced a little too perfectly, hunting for the adjusting entry that hid the lie. And she found instead the opposite, a man whose account of himself did not balance in his own favor, who had left the ugliest number in plain sight and made no effort to net it against anything. In her experience, only honest books did that. Liars always tried to make themselves whole. All right, she said at last. I believe you didn't decide it at 26. I don't absolve you for the years after, when you knew and did nothing. Those are 2 separate accounts, and I'm keeping them separate. Good, said Damiano Vitale. So am I. I've kept them separate for 11 years. The alliance had rules, and Nora set most of them, laying them out the way she laid out a working file. Bruno goes down my way, she said, in daylight, on paper, in a federal courtroom, on financial charges, with my father's conviction vacated on the same docket. My father spent 19 months telling the truth to people who'd already decided the numbers were his, and he lost, because the truth without proof is just a man insisting. I have proof now, or I have the start of it. I have his real working papers, and I have the forger's hand, and I have a live thread on Independence Avenue. Together with whatever your family knows, we might have enough to put in front of a grand jury instead of in the ground. That's slower than my way, Damiano said, and there's a problem with it you should hear now. One forged ledger from 11 years ago and one padded invoice from a barbecue joint won't convict Cesare Bruno of anything. A federal money laundering case needs the whole architecture. The shells, the layering, the current operation. Live. And the only way to build that is from inside his active laundering, which means someone has to be close enough to the books he's cooking right now to document the pattern as it happens. He looked at her. You're a forensic bookkeeper. You sit inside the financial records of businesses all over the city. You are, without exaggeration, the single best-placed person alive to catch Cesare Bruno laundering in real time, because you can read the one thing he's certain no one can read, which is his own hand. So you want me to keep working the books. I want you to keep being the person nobody watches, Damiano said, in exactly the accounts where it matters most, which is the most dangerous thing I could ask you to do, and I want you to understand that before you agree. Your father, Bruno, destroyed with a lie, because a lie was enough to handle a bookkeeper nobody would miss. If he understands what you actually are, that you can read his hand, he won't try to frame you. He'll erase you. He already sent men to a bar for you on a rumor. And what do I get out of it? Every ordinary thing you have taken away for good. He didn't soften it. By spring, people will know your name who have no business knowing it. You'll never again be the woman in the back of the room that no one looks at. That anonymity has kept you safe your whole life, and you'd be giving it up on purpose to clear a dead man's name, which is either the best reason I've ever heard or the worst. I genuinely can't tell. Nora thought about a ledger that was a confession, and a father who believed the numbers always told the truth eventually. My father used to say everybody confesses in the numbers if you read long enough, she said. It killed him. I'm going to prove he was right. Yes, I'm in. There was a third rule, and she almost didn't say it, and then she did. And my mother stays completely out of it. She's 67 and her heart is failing, and she needs a procedure in the spring, and I have half the money. She buried my father from a distance because they wouldn't release him to a hospital in time, and as she catches even the edge of this, it'll finish her. Her voice cracked once on the last word. She's the last thing Bruno hasn't touched. Damiano was quiet a moment. What's the number? The procedure. That's not what's the number, Nora. 23,000. And I don't want your. It's done Monday, he said, and it's not part of the deal, and you can be as angry about it as you like. I watched a man go to Leavenworth 11 years ago for a crime that made another man rich. And I did nothing, because there was nothing I could prove. I'm not going to sit across a table from his daughter and watch her mother die on a wait list over $23,000 while I do nothing again. Some things aren't transactions. I learned that from a woman who kissed a stranger in a bar last night on the correct theory that he was the safest man in the room. The corner of his mouth moved. She was right, for the record. She just didn't know why. The armor came, as it seemed to for anyone pulled into Damiano's orbit, through a stylist named Fabienne Cross, who arrived at the duplex on truce with a rack of clothes and an assignment he'd been handed backwards. He circled Nora once, slowly, with the expression of a man asked to solve a shape he'd been told was unsolvable. So, here's the thinking. You'll be moving through offices and client meetings, professional settings, and we want understated, we want you to blend. So I'm seeing long, dark lines. Something that quiets the whole silhouette, takes the eye up and away, keeps you. She spends her life being taken for granted by people who look right past her. That's not a look you need to build, Fabian. It's the thing she's trying to stop happening. Damiano was in the doorway. Nora hadn't heard him arrive. She was beginning to understand she never would. I don't need her to blend. I need her to walk into a room full of people who assume the bookkeeper doesn't matter and make them so busy revising that opinion that they forget to wonder what she's actually reading. Take the drapes back to the van. Fabian left in 90 seconds. I could have handled him, Nora said. I know you could, but he was wrong, and I'm tired of watching people be wrong about you in front of me. He looked at the empty rack. What do you actually want to wear? And Nora, who had answered something dark, something plain every time that question had been asked of her since she was 15, told the truth for once. Bronze, she said. Not a shy one, the real thing, warm, with weight to it, structured, something that holds its own line and doesn't drape over me apologizing. Her chin came up. It's the color of an old ledger's edges, the color they used to make real money out of, before it was paper. My father kept a brass desk lamp for 26 years and never let anyone else touch it. She surprised herself. I've spent 11 years making other people's numbers look honest. I've never once made myself look like anything. Then make yourself look like something, said Damiano Vitale. You've got a better eye than anyone Fabian employs. Build it and send me the bill. The slow burn happened in the margins of the work, which is where real things always happen. He started coming to the duplex at night, after the office, when they went through her father's 4 years line by line and cross-referenced them against everything the Vitale organization had ever known about Bruno's shells. He'd sit across her kitchen table under the brass lamp while she read the forger's hand aloud. They're 3.5 points. That's him. That's the same padding. He can't help it. And somewhere in those nights the deal quietly stopped being a deal. Why do you sit with your back to the door? He asked one night. Even here, even with me, you always take the chair that faces the wall, so no one's looking at me from behind. She didn't look up from the ledger. You learn it early, being big. You put a wall behind you so there's one less direction the looking can come from. By the time I found a job where nobody looks at you on purpose, it felt like the world had finally been built to fit for once. She turned a page. You'd understand. Everyone looks at you, and it's all fear. Nobody ever just lets you be a man having coffee at a table. Damiano was quiet a moment. My brother did, he said. Matteo. He was 26, 4 years ago. A supper club off 12th Street, a Sunday, 30 people in the room, and every one of them suddenly found something fascinating about the tablecloth. His hands were flat on the table. I've known for 4 years who paid for it. Never proved a line, and afterward there was an accounting. An estate, his businesses, all of it had to be untangled. And there was a forensic accountant the family brought in, some stranger, who found $40,000 Matteo had quietly been sending to a widow in the North End for 2 years and had told no one about, because that was the kind of man my brother actually was underneath all of it. He looked at her. The numbers told me who my brother was after he was dead. A stranger read it out of the books. I never even knew the accountant's name. Nora's hands went still on the ledger. I did an estate reconstruction 4 years ago, she said quietly. A young man. Gunshot. The family brought me in because the businesses were a mess and the partners were circling. She met his eyes. I remember it because in the middle of untangling it, I found a standing transfer, $40,000 a year, to a woman in the North End, structured so it wouldn't show on anything anyone would look at. And I remember thinking, whoever this man was, he was kinder than the people fighting over his money. I put it in the report where his mother would see it and the partners wouldn't. I didn't know he was your brother. Damiano Vitale sat at her kitchen table and put his hand over his mouth, and for a moment the coldest man in Kansas City could not speak. You found the kindest thing about my brother, he said finally, and you hid it where only the person who loved him would look. That's the job, said Nora. The numbers are a confession, and most of what people confess is worse than you'd think. And every so often, it's better. And when it's better, you make sure the right person gets to read it. She closed the ledger. My father believed that. It's the thing they buried him for believing. Turns out he was right. You just have to survive long enough for the right reader to sit down at the table. He came around the table then and stood beside her and did not touch her, and she did not touch him, which, given how they'd started, given a fistful of lapel in a crowded bar, was somehow louder than anything else could have been. When this is over, he said. "I'm going to want to talk to you about the reason you picked me in that bar, not the tactical reason. The other one. I'm telling you now so it doesn't come at you sideways later. I don't do things sideways." When it's over, Nora agreed, and went back to her father's numbers with her heart going like something trying to get out of a box. The first strike came out of a barbecue restaurant. Nora kept working the Independence Avenue account, quietly, legitimately through the firm, and within 3 weeks she had documented the whole live operation, the invented vendors, the padded invoices, the structured cash deposits sized precisely to stay under reporting thresholds, all of it in the same hand, 3.5 points the forger still working, still careless in the exact way he'd always been careless because no one had ever caught him. And then she found the thing that turned a pattern into a case. "He reuses vendor shells," she told Damiano, and a federal prosecutor his people had spent 4 years cultivating, laying the pages across a table. The forger, he's lazy, brilliant, but lazy, the way people get when they've never once been caught. He invented a fake meat vendor 11 years ago to layer money through my father's distributor. A fictional company, a made-up name, a phantom. She set 2 pages side by side. And he used the same fake vendor 3 weeks ago on the barbecue account. Same invented name, updated address, same tax ID structure. He recycled an 11-year-old ghost because he never imagined anyone would ever be looking at both sets of books at once. She looked up. "I'm the only person who's ever seen both, because I'm the only one who kept my father's papers, and the only one who learned his hand, and the only one who happened to reconcile an intake file on Independence Avenue at 4 o'clock on the Thursday." The prosecutor, a careful woman who'd been burned before, looked at a heavy bookkeeper matching an invented vendor across 11 years and 2 crimes, and said quietly, "How many years of these books can you read?" "All of them," said Nora Bennett. "Every account I've ever touched, and my father's before me. In a handwriting the man who wrote it is certain no one alive can read. Salvatore Conti, Damiano's aging consigliere, 79 and half blind, listened to it all, and then took off his glasses and pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes. "For 4 years, the old man said, we have tried to trace the money Bruno bleeds out of us, and we could never follow it, because it disappears into books we cannot read, and you're telling me the answer was a bookkeeper. The one person Bruno hands his own crimes to in writing and trusts to keep them because he's certain she's too small to matter." He shook his head slowly. "He signs his confessions in a language he thinks is dead. And the one woman who speaks it has been sitting in the back of the room the whole time. That," said Nora, "is the first useful thing that has ever come of being in the back of the room." The retaliation came the way Damiano had warned her it would. Not through a lie this time, because a lie was no longer enough. Bruno had understood from the Independence Avenue thread and the bar and the sudden challenges that the bookkeeper was not a rumor to be managed, but a problem to be removed. He did not know exactly what she had. He knew where she kept it, because someone told him. Meridian Bookkeeping kept its client files by regulation in a fireproof records room on the 4th floor, rows of tall steel shelving mounted on tracks, the kind that slid together to save space and rolled apart on a hand crank when you needed an aisle. Compact mobile shelving, 10,000 pounds of loaded steel per unit, gliding on a geared wheel a child could turn. Nora spent hours in that room. It was the one place in the office as quiet and orderly as the inside of her own head. She was there late on a Tuesday alone building the master exhibit index for the grand jury, because Grace had gone home and Gerald was long gone and the 4th floor after 7 belonged to the cleaning crew and to her. She heard the stairwell door open, not the elevator, the stairs, and a tread crossed the carpet toward the records room that was wrong, careful, unhurried. A man who did not want to be heard, in a building where everyone who belonged made noise because they had nothing to hide. Then he came around the corner, into the records room doorway holding a clipboard and wearing a courier's vest. And he said pleasantly, "Delivery from Meridian, need a signature. Got an invoice here, supplies reorder." And he held out a sheet of paper. And Nora Bennett, who had reconciled 40,000 invoices, looked at the one in his hand for exactly 1 second and knew. The vendor number was 6 digits. Meridian's office supply vendor used 5. The tax line rounded up instead of down. The subtotal and the total did not agree by $4.11, and no real invoice in the history of commerce failed to add up because the software wouldn't let it. A real invoice's total is generated, not typed. This total had been typed by someone who had never had to make numbers reconcile in his life, because he'd always had someone like Nora or like her father to do it for him. The numbers didn't add up. And in Nora's world, when the numbers didn't add up, it was never an accident. It was always a lie standing in the room with you. She did not scream. She did not run for the door because he was in the door. She looked at the room the way she looked at a set of books, for the thing that was actually there, not the thing that was supposed to be. And what was actually there was 11 tons of steel shelving on greased tracks and a hand crank and a single narrow aisle currently rolled open between two loaded stacks. And the fact that she was standing at the crank end of it, and he was going to have to come up that aisle to reach her. "Sign it and I'll go," the man said, stepping into the aisle. His other hand was moving toward the back of the vest. "Easy night for both of us. Let me get my glasses," Nora said, and turned to the crank wheel at the end of the fixed stack, as though she needed to read and put both hands on it. And both 150 pounds of everything the world had spent 34 years telling her to apologize for. He was 4 steps into the aisle when she threw her whole weight against the wheel and drove the 10,000-pound mobile shelf down its track and into him, and pinned him, chest and gun arm both, between two walls of loaded steel that did not care in the slightest how strong he was, because he was not fighting a woman anymore. He was fighting gearing and mass and a heavy person who had found the exact place to stand, and a body at rest that weighs 5 tons does not move for a man with one arm trapped and no leverage. Nora did not reach for the gun she could see wedged uselessly against his hip. She had already decided, somewhere in the last 4 seconds, that she was never once in this life going to be the woman who lets go of what's working to grab for a weapon she doesn't know how to use. She leaned on the crank and held the aisle closed on him, immovable, and said in the flat, even voice she used to tell a client their partner had been robbing them, "You're going to stay exactly there, because I outweigh the argument, and the next people through that stairwell door work for a man Cesare Bruno is very much afraid of. And if I were you, I'd be extremely glad it's me holding this wheel and not them." He swore at her. He told her what he'd been sent to do. She thought about $11 million in her father's name, and a heart attack 30 miles up the river, and she did not let the wheel move a quarter inch for 6 minutes. Enzo Marchetti came through the stairwell door at a dead run. Damiano had put a man on the building the way he'd put a man on everything Nora touched without telling her, because he'd learned within a week that she'd refuse protection for herself and accept it for the work, and stopped at the sight of a heavy woman in a good bronze blouse holding 5 tons of steel shut on an armed man with nothing but a hand crank and her own refusal to let go. Nora Bennett, Enzo said, the first time anyone had called her that, and she would not understand the weight of it for weeks. "We have him." She let go of the wheel only when Enzo's hand was on it. She did not watch what came after. She went and stood at the window over the gray river and breathed until Damiano got there. He came 11 minutes later, having driven from across the city in a way that did not respect physics or traffic law. And he crossed the records room and found her at the window and turned her by the shoulder. And she watched the coldest man in Kansas City come completely apart at the seams. His hands were not steady. Something behind his eyes had gone off its hinges. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Look at me. Are you hurt?" "No, Damiano, I'm not. Her teeth had started to chatter now that it was over. "The invoice was wrong. That's how I knew. The total didn't match the line items by $4.11, and no real invoice does that, and I looked at it and I knew the way I knew in the bar, the way I always know when a number's lying." He kissed her among the steel stacks, and it was not the careful, delighted thing from the bar. It had the whole drive across the city in it. Every red light. Every second of not knowing whether the man on the building had gotten there first. One hand at the back of her neck, and one flat between her shoulder blades, and he pulled her in like a man closing a wound, and Nora took a fistful of his lapel. The same grip she'd started all of it with in a crowded bar on a gamble, and pulled him in just as hard. When they came apart, he kept his forehead against hers. "Nobody gets near you again," he said, very low. "Not a courier, not a delivery. Nobody. I put a man on this building and he still nearly." His voice failed. "How did that man know the records were on the 4th floor? How did he know you'd be alone on a Tuesday?" Nora went very still. "The building's after-hours access," she said slowly. "The badge system, the cleaning schedule, the floor plans, which nights I sign in late alone. That's all in the building's security account. The vendor contract." Her hands went cold again. "Damiano, who set up my protection on your side, who has the account that watches this building and knows my schedule." Damiano's face had gone to the flat, terrible stillness she'd first seen in the corner of a bar. "Renzo," he said. "Renzo Fontana handles our outside security contracts. He set up the vendor on this building. He'd have the access schedule. He'd know which nights you're here alone." His jaw worked, and he was the one who told me 3 weeks ago to stop wasting resources protecting a bookkeeper. Renzo Fontana had been Damiano Vitale's underboss for 9 years. He had carried Matteo's casket. He had a laugh you could hear through 2 closed doors, and when Damiano said his name in the records room, Nora's first thought was that it couldn't be, and her second arriving 11 seconds later was a cold, arithmetical certainty. But she did not deal in certainty, she dealt in reconciliation. So she asked for a night with the books, because here was what 11 years of studying one forger's hand had built into her. Nora didn't just know how Bruno's launderer worked. She knew the fingerprints of every shell that hand had ever created. And a launderer inside the Vitale organization, someone feeding Bruno access for 11 years, would have had to move his own cuts somehow. Traders have to be paid, and payment leaves a trail, and a trail is a set of numbers, and numbers were the one language Nora Bennett could not be lied to in. She went through everything Damiano's organization had ever given her, cross-referenced against her father's 4 years, and she built the reconciliation until dawn. And the answer rose out of the numbers the way a body surfaces. The invented meat vendor, the 11-year-old ghost the forger had recycled onto the barbecue books, had received payments across all its incarnations from a second source she hadn't traced before, a construction contractor. And that contractor had, for 9 years, held the outside security contracts for the Vitale organization's buildings, awarded and renewed and paid every year by the underboss who signed off on outside contractors. Renzo Fontana had been laundering his own payoff from Cesare Bruno through the exact same shell that framed Thomas Bennett. For 11 years, since before he'd carried Matteo's casket, since before Damiano ever took over. He hadn't just turned 4 months ago. He'd been Bruno's inside man from the beginning, the one who'd told Bruno which clean, dull businesses the Vitale money touched, which was how Bruno had known to run it through a meat distributor in the first place, which was how a bookkeeper named Thomas Bennett had ended up with $11 million in his name. "He's the reason," Nora told Damiano, laying the reconciliation across the table. Her father's 4 years and Renzo's 9 side by side, connected by a single invented vendor. "Renzo didn't just sell you. He's the reason my father was ever chosen." He pointed Bruno at the distributor. "He's the bridge. And he's been the bridge since before you and I were ever going to meet. The same fake company paid off both our father's destruction. Mine in a courtroom, yours in a supper club off 12th Street. Her hands were flat on the pages. It was always the same 3.5 points, Damiano. It was always the same lazy, brilliant, careless hand. And it belonged to a man who called himself your brother." Damiano Vitale looked at 11 years of numbers laid out on a table and understood that the man who had carried Matteo's casket had helped bury her father before the two of them had ever met, and he said, very quietly, "I want him in a room." "No." Nora stepped in front of him. "Not your way. This one especially. Nora, listen to me." Her hand flat on his chest over the heart. "You've wanted the fast way for 4 years, and it never once got you proof. If you take Renzo tonight, he dies quiet and takes 11 years of accounts into the ground. and Cesare Bruno launders through a new business by Monday, and you're a photograph on the news by Friday. My father spent 19 months insisting on the truth with nothing in his hands, and he lost. We have his real books. We have the recycled vendor. We have a courier who failed to make an invoice add up. We have Renzo's payoff running through the same ghost company for 11 years. She leaned in. Take all of it into a federal courtroom, in daylight on paper with their names on it, and put me in the room when it happens. Both of them, and put my father's conviction on the same docket. Vacated in the permanent record of the United States, where they buried it. Enzo Marchetti, who had loved Renzo Fontana for 9 years, spoke from the doorway in a voice like gravel. "She's right, boss," he said. And it cost him everything. The dismantling took 29 days, and it went in the order Nora chose. And she chose it the way she built a case. Foundation first, structure second, the name at the top of the page last. Eleanor Prescott went first because she was the hinge. She had been a senior compliance officer at the bank, the one that held Bruno's largest holding company, the one Preston Wilder answered to. And for 11 years she had signed off on structured deposits and waved through suspicious activity thresholds that any first-year analyst would have flagged, because a foundation she chaired received clean and generous donations from businesses she was supposed to be watching. She was the reason $11 million had ever moved without a single alarm. Nora sat across a conference table from her with 2 federal attorneys and slid one reconciliation across the wood. "You have until 5 o'clock, Nora said, to resign every position you hold and hand the bank's compliance files to the U.S. Attorney voluntarily. Voluntarily is the better version. Nobody offered my father the better version. You're the one who was supposed to catch what was done in his name, and you looked away for 11 years. Eleanor Prescott looked at the reconciliation and then at the heavy bookkeeper across the table. "I'm sorry," she said. "Who are you?" "I've reconciled accounts you certified for 6 years," said Nora Bennett. "You've never once known my name. You should have wondered who was actually reading the numbers you signed." She resigned at 4:44. The Ashford collapse took 11 days, and Nora had nothing to do with it, which was the sweetest part. Camilla Ashford, old Kansas City money, who'd never wronged Nora personally, only floated through the city on a fortune she'd been told never to ask about, and who had once, at a bank gala, looked at Nora on Damiano's periphery and murmured something about the staff dressing above their station. Came to the duplex on Truce in the rain with nothing prepared. "They took everything," she said. "Nobody tells you where the money comes from. You just sign where they point." "It came from businesses your family's bank laundered for 11 years, Nora said. "Some of it is the exact spread they skimmed off the accounts they put in my father's name." "You've been spending my father's ruin your whole life, Camilla. Go home, and when you can't find one, sit with the fact that you never once asked whose money it was." Preston Wilder was arrested in April. The only one of them Nora watched them take, because Preston had made himself part of it the night he walked into a bar to collect her. His bank had processed the structured deposits, and Preston had personally shepherded Bruno's accounts, and when the compliance files opened, his signature was on enough of it to matter. He sent her a long message from his lawyer's office about how much he'd grown. She read the first line and deleted the rest. Renzo Fontana was taken on a Sunday, on a federal warrant, without a shot fired, and what Damiano had considered doing instead is a thing Nora never asked about, then or since. And on a Thursday in June, in the federal courthouse on Grand Boulevard, Cesare Bruno was arraigned on 71 counts. He was 75, small, beautifully dressed, with the pleasant, unhurried face of a man who had never once been asked to account for anything. He scanned the gallery on his way in the way you'd scan a balance sheet for the line that mattered. His eyes went over Nora, sitting in the second row, and kept going. She stood up. "Mr. Bruno." The marshal's hand came up. The room turned. He stopped and looked at her with complete, courteous incomprehension. "I'm sorry," he said. "Have we met?" And Nora Bennett smiled, because that, precisely that, was the architecture of her whole life, handed to her one last time, gift-wrapped. "No," she said. "You've never met me. 11 years ago you ran $11 million through a meat distributor's books, and kept the second ledger in the name of an honest man named Thomas Bennett, and when it surfaced, you let him take all of it, and he died in Leavenworth, 30 miles from his own desk, and the record still says he was a launderer." Her voice did not rise. "You spent 11 years signing your crimes into books you were certain no one could read. My father used to say everyone confesses in the numbers eventually. You confessed in every single ledger you ever forged, in a hand as good as a signature, and you never worried about it, because you decided the person who kept the books didn't matter." She held his eyes. "You were half right. The bookkeeper doesn't matter to a man like you. That's exactly why the bookkeeper is the one who ends you. I'm his daughter, and I read every word you wrote." The gallery was silent. The judge asked her to sit. She sat. She never spoke to Cesare Bruno again. But at the door on his way out, he turned his head and looked back at her, and then he knew her completely far too late. And Nora Bennett let him carry that out of the room the way she let a set of books carry the truth out of every dishonest office she'd ever cleaned, quietly, permanently, and without ever letting go of it herself. 6 weeks later, a federal judge signed an order vacating the 11-year-old conviction of Thomas Bennett, finding, on the basis of newly authenticated records, that the laundering ledgers had been forged in his name by another hand, and that Thomas Bennett had kept only honest books. The permanent record of the United States was corrected to say that a man who died in Leavenworth had told the exact truth for 19 months. Margaret Bennett, 67, with a repaired heart and another 20 years of opinions in it, read that order at her kitchen table with the brass desk lamp on. She'd taken it back the day Nora brought his box home, and she put it down and looked at her daughter and said the only thing there was to say. "Your father used to tell me the numbers would outlast the liars." Her hands were steady on the paper. He just never guessed it would be you doing the adding. They were married in October, in a church on the west side, with the doors open to the street. Grace Molina cried from the second pew and blamed the candles. Enzo Marchetti stood at the end of the aisle in a suit that had lost its argument with his shoulders and wept openly and dared anyone to remark on it. Salvatore Conti, 80, gave the blessing, and the part he said in English was this: "This family buried a son and trusted the man who sold him, and it learned nothing. For 11 years, our enemy hid his crimes in numbers none of us could read, and no one could catch him, while a woman who read those numbers better than anyone alive sat in the back of every room, and not one of us looked at her." He looked out over the church. "Remember what she built out of being overlooked, and the next time any of you decides someone at the edge of the room doesn't matter, remember that someone is always keeping the books." Nobody laughed. That was the point. Nora wore bronze, warm and structured, and the color of old money, and her father's lamp, cut by her own eye. And she had not taken in 1 inch of it to make anyone more comfortable. And at the front, with 200 people watching, Damiano Vitale did the thing he'd sworn he only ever did in front of one person. He went down on one knee. "You kissed me in a crowded bar," he said quietly, so only she could hear, "because you'd read the whole room and decided I was the safest man in it. You were the first person in my adult life to look at me and see safe instead of afraid." He took her hand. "So here's what I'm offering, and you can read it like a ledger and check that it balances, because I know you will. Everything I have. For the rest of it, no second set of books, nothing hidden off the page, every number where you can see it." The corner of his mouth moved. "Reconcile that and tell me if it adds up." And Nora Bennett, who had spent 11 years hunting the one account that wouldn't balance, looked at a man who'd laid his whole self out in plain sight with nothing netted or hidden, and found, for once, that everything did. "It adds up," she said, and pulled him to his feet because she was done watching anyone she loved kneel to anything. So that is the story of a woman who spent 11 years as the last person anyone in the room bothered to look at. The bookkeeper, the counter of other people's money. The one they trusted with their numbers precisely because they were certain she was too small to understand what the numbers meant. They were right that she'd never repeat a word. They were wrong about all the rest, because money has a handwriting, and she had spent 11 years learning to read the one hand that ruined her father. And when the man who did it finally sat down and signed his crimes into a ledger he was sure no one could read, she read every line. She kissed a cold stranger in a bar on a desperate gamble, and it turned out to be the truest thing she ever added up. The numbers outlasted the liars. Her father promised they would. He just never guessed it would be his daughter holding the pen. If Nora's reckoning gave you chills, hit that like button and share this with someone who loves a heroine who takes her own power instead of waiting to be handed it. Subscribe for a new full-length dark romance every week. And tell me down in the comments, Camilla, Preston, Renzo, or Cesare Bruno, which one of them deserved it most?